Welcome back. I'm glad you're here tonight. If you don't mind, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing that. And if slow, haunting stories like this one help carry you towards sleep, consider liking and subscribing so more of these can find you. Now, get comfortable. Let your body grow still. Let the sounds around you fade into silence. Tonight, as the night grows quieter, the shadows begin to whisper, and another haunting story unfolds. So, close your eyes, listen carefully, and let yourself drift into this. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I was a conservator. Paper, ink, old bindings, the slow and patient work of coaxing centuries back from decay. And 3 years ago, I received an invitation I still don't understand. One I've turned over so many times in my mind that the memory has gone smooth and strange, like a stone worried between fingers for too long. It came in the form of a man, not a letter, not an email, not any of the ordinary channels through which such work usually finds its way to someone like me. A man named Baldassare, thin as a reed, with the kind of stillness in his face that made him hard to place in age or intention. He found me at a cafe near the Tiber, on an afternoon so ordinary I can still taste the bitterness of the espresso I'd ordered and barely touched, the traffic noise bleeding faintly through the open door, tourists laughing somewhere behind me, in a language I didn't bother to place. He didn't introduce himself with credentials. He didn't hand me a business card, didn't reference an institution, a gallery, a university, a foundation. Nothing that could be looked up, verified, traced back to a desk and a name and a salary. He simply sat, uninvited, across from me, folded his hands together with the precision of a man accustomed to silence, and said that he represented an archive in need of restoration work. When I asked which archive, he said only that the material was sensitive, and when I pressed further, he added, almost as an afterthought, that it was old beyond cataloguing. That phrase should have been the end of it. Any reasonable person, any conservator, with functioning instincts and a healthy respect for their own safety, would have thanked him for his time and gone back to their coffee, back to their ordinary Roman afternoon, marked with a small, unremarkable life waiting for them outside that cafe. But I was not, at that point in my life, a reasonable person operating on healthy instincts. My marriage had ended 6 months earlier, quietly, the way things end when neither party has the energy left to make it loud, a slow leaking out of shared history, until one day there was simply nothing left to hold the shape of a life together. I had moved out of the apartment we'd shared for 9 years. I had left behind furniture, photographs, a life that no longer recognized me as belonging to it. My daughter Elena stayed with her mother in Turin, and I told myself this was temporary, told myself I would find my footing and go back for her, back to some version of fatherhood that still made sense. I had nothing tying me to Rome. I had, in truth, nothing tying me to anywhere. I was a man untethered, floating through a city that wasn't mine, doing small restoration jobs for private collectors, patching torn maps, and repairing water-damaged Bibles for people who barely looked at me when they handed over payment. So when Baldassare offered me a contract that was, in his words, unusually generous, I didn't ask enough questions. I should have asked who was funding it. I should have asked why an archive significant enough to command that kind of payment had no name, no public record, no paper trail of any kind. I should have asked why he'd chosen me specifically, out of all the conservators in Rome, in Florence, in Venice, men and women with far more prestigious resumes than my own quiet, unremarkable career. I asked none of it. I sat there in the afternoon light, watching him fold and unfold his thin hands, and I said yes before I'd finished my coffee, the word leaving my mouth with an ease that frightens me now, in retrospect, more than almost anything that came after. He didn't smile when I agreed. That should have told me something too. He simply nodded, as though my answer had never truly been in question. as though the outcome of our meeting had been decided long before he sat down across from me. He told me to be ready the following Monday, gave me an address that turned out to be nothing more than an unmarked door along a side street near the Vatican walls, and then he stood, straightened his jacket, and left without shaking my hand. I watched him go, thin frame dissolving into the crowd with an unsettling grace, and I remember thinking, in the naive way a person thinks before they understand what they've agreed to, that this might be the beginning of something good, a fresh start, a reason to stay in Rome a little longer, to delay the return to Turin, to delay facing what remained of my life. I didn't sleep well that weekend, though I told myself it was excitement. I packed a small bag of tools, my gloves, my brushes, my magnifying loupe, the instruments of a trade that had always felt to me like a kind of quiet devotion, a way of honouring what time tries to erase. I called Elena that Sunday night, our regular ritual, and she showed me a drawing she'd made of a horse with too many legs, laughing at her own mistake, and I laughed with her, and for a moment the ache of missing her dulled into something bearable. I told her I had a new job starting, something important, something that might mean I could send for her sooner than we'd planned. She asked if it was scary. I told her no, of course not. It was just old books. I believed that when I said it. I want you to understand that I believed it completely. Monday morning came grey and cool, the kind of Roman morning where the light hasn't yet decided what kind of day it will become. I found the address exactly where Baldassare had said it would be, an unmarked door, wood so old it had gone the colour of ash, set into a wall that gave no indication of what lay behind it. I knocked, and a long silence followed before the door opened. Not from the inside by any visible hand at first, but as though it had simply decided, on its own accord, that it was time. I know now how foolish that sounds. I know how much easier it would be to say a person opened it, an ordinary door attended by an ordinary hand, but I stood on that threshold for a full 3 seconds, with no one visible, before Baldassare's face appeared in the gap, pale in the shadowed interior, gesturing for me to come inside. I stepped through, and the door closed behind me with a sound too heavy for its size, a deep and final thud that seemed to swallow the street noise whole, cutting off the ordinary Roman morning as cleanly as a blade. I remember standing there in the dim entryway, my bag of tools heavy on my shoulder, and feeling, for the first time, a small and nagging wrongness settle into my chest. Not fear exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it, some quiet animal sense that I had crossed a boundary I didn't fully understand, and that the door behind me might not open again as easily as it had a moment ago. Baldassare said nothing. He simply turned and began walking deeper into the dark, and because I had nothing else, no one waiting for me, nowhere else I needed to be, I followed him. I have asked myself many times since why I didn't turn around in that moment, why some instinct didn't seize me and drag me back through that door before it fully closed. I have no answer that satisfies me. I only know that I followed, and that everything after followed from that single, unremarkable choice. A man with nothing to lose, walking willingly into a place that had already decided, long before I arrived, exactly what it intended to take from me. They didn't take me through anything resembling the Rome I knew, the Rome of postcards and pilgrims, and gelato melting in the summer heat. Baldassare led me through service corridors instead, narrow, unlit passages that smelled of damp stone and old electrical wiring, the kind of spaces built for the invisible labour that keeps grand buildings standing, never meant to be seen by the people who admire the facade. We walked for what felt like much longer than the modest distance should have taken, past pipes wrapped in decaying insulation, past doors marked with numbers in a numbering system I didn't recognize, past a single flickering bulb that buzzed with a frequency I could feel in my teeth. And always down. That's the detail that has stayed with me most vividly, more than any specific image from that first descent. The relentless downward slope of the corridors, staircase after staircase, each one narrower and older than the last, until the modern service passages gave way to something else entirely. Something built of stone so old it had the texture of bone, worn smooth in the center of each step by centuries of feet I couldn't begin to count. Baldassare moved through it all without hesitation, without once checking a map or consulting a phone, as though the route had been carved into him as deeply as it had been carved into the stone itself. We reached, eventually, a set of doors unlike anything I'd encountered in any archive, public or private, in my entire career. They required 2 keys, held by 2 separate men who stood on either side of the threshold, like sentries carved from the same grey stillness as the walls around them. The men didn't speak to each other. They didn't speak to Baldassare. They didn't speak to me. They simply produced their keys in a kind of practiced, wordless synchrony, turned them in locks I couldn't see clearly in the dim light, and stepped back to allow the doors to swing open on hinges that made no sound at all. No creak, no groan, nothing, as though the doors themselves had learned long ago the value of silence. The air changed the moment we crossed that threshold. I want to describe it precisely, because it's a detail I've returned to again and again in the years since, trying to understand what it meant, what it was telling me even then, before I had any reason to listen. It was dry, desert dry, the kind of dryness that pulls moisture from your eyes and throat within minutes. But beneath the dryness, there was something else, something faintly metallic, almost mineral, like the smell of a coin held too long in a closed fist, or like old blood pressed flat and preserved between the pages of a book left shut for 100 years. I remember breathing it in and feeling my chest tighten slightly, some subconscious recognition that this was not simply old air, not simply the natural staleness of an underground room sealed off from ventilation, but something that had been cultivated, curated, kept exactly as it was, for reasons I couldn't yet guess at. The final room, when we reached it, had no windows. Of course it had no windows. We were, by my estimation, at least 4 or 5 stories beneath street level by then, though I'd lost precise count of the stairs, somewhere around the 3rd flight. But the absence of windows felt like more than a simple architectural fact. It felt deliberate, almost hostile, as though the room had been designed specifically to prevent daylight from ever touching whatever it contained. The shelves rose around us in the gloom, tall wooden structures that stretched up into a darkness so complete I couldn't see where they ended, couldn't tell if the ceiling was 10 feet above us or 50, and something about that uncertainty unsettled me more than any specific detail I could point to. There is a particular kind of fear that comes not from what you can see, but from what you can't quite measure, from a space that refuses to give you its true dimensions. Baldassare walked ahead of me to a small table near the center of the room, the only piece of furniture that seemed designed for actual human use. A simple wooden desk, worn smooth at the edges, with a single lamp that cast a weak circle of yellow light, barely large enough to work within. He opened a drawer and withdrew a pair of white cotton gloves, the kind I'd used 1,000 times in my career, and held them out to me without ceremony. I took them, my fingers brushing his for just a moment, and I remember his skin felt cool in a way that seemed at odds with the dry warmth of the room around us. Cool in the manner of something that had spent a very long time away from sunlight. "You will restore," he said, and his voice in that space had a strange quality to it, flat and quiet, as though the room itself were absorbing some portion of the sound before it reached my ears. "You will not read, you will not photograph," he said, each instruction with the same weight, the same finality, as though they were not requests, but immutable laws of the space we now occupied. I asked him why, a natural question, the kind of question any professional would ask when handed restrictions that made their job considerably more difficult, since reading, even briefly, is often essential to understanding how a document should be handled, what materials were used in its creation, what era and tradition it might belong to. He didn't answer. He simply looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the poor light, and then he turned and walked back toward the doors we'd entered through, his footsteps silent on the stone floor, in a way that struck me, even then, as faintly wrong, as though the room swallowed the sound of him, the same way it had swallowed the sound of the hinges, the same way it seemed to swallow so much of what should have been ordinary and audible. He left without another word, without instructions on hours, without a schedule, without so much as pointing me toward the specific texts I was meant to begin with. The doors closed behind him with that same heavy, final thud I'd heard above, and then I was alone, standing in a windowless room beneath the city, gloved hands hanging at my sides, surrounded by shelves of unknown height, holding an unknown quantity of unknown material, with no clear sense of how I was meant to begin, or how long I was meant to stay, or what, precisely, I had agreed to become a part of. I stood there for a long time before I moved. I remember that clearly, the strange paralysis that settled over me in those first minutes alone, a kind of held breath that lasted far longer than it should have. The lamp on the desk hummed faintly, a low electrical whine just at the edge of hearing, and somewhere in the shelves above me I thought I heard something shift, a soft settling sound like old paper adjusting itself in the dark, though I told myself, as I would tell myself so many times in the months that followed, that it was nothing, old wood contracting in dry air, nothing more, nothing worth the fear that had already begun, quietly and without my permission, to take root somewhere beneath my ribs. The manuscripts were not Latin. That was the first thing I understood, standing alone in that windowless room with the gloves Baldassare had given me still stiff and unworn on my hands. And it was also the first thing that told me this job would be nothing like the restorations I'd built my career on. I had spent years with Latin, with its familiar cadences, its predictable declensions, the comfort of recognizing a word even in a script degraded by centuries of damp and neglect. I had worked with Greek too, with its sharp angles and its own particular logic, and even with fragments of Aramaic that had come through my hands during a brief apprenticeship in my 20s. I knew, in other words, what unfamiliar looked like. I had a frame of reference for encountering something old and strange and slowly coaxing it into legibility. Nothing in that frame of reference prepared me for what filled the shelves of that room. The script curved in on itself in ways that defied the logic of any writing system I had ever studied. Spirals within spirals, characters that seemed to fold back toward their own beginnings, rather than progressing forward in the linear fashion every human language I knew of eventually settled into. I remember holding the first page up to the weak lamplight, turning it slightly, trying to find the angle at which the symbols would resolve into something my mind could categorize, a root system, a family, some hint of Phoenician or Sanskrit, or even a constructed alphabet I simply hadn't encountered before. I found nothing. The symbols refused to settle into any lineage I recognized, and worse, they seemed to resist the kind of steady visual attention that restoration work requires. I would fix my eyes on a single character, trying to memorize its shape so I could note it in my restoration log, and by the time I looked back at it after glancing away, I would find myself uncertain whether it had shifted slightly, whether a curve that had swept left now swept right, whether an extra stroke had appeared at its base. I told myself, in those early days, that this was simply fatigue. The lighting in the room was poor, a single desk lamp doing the work that should have belonged to proper archival illumination, and I reasoned that poor light, combined with long hours of close, strained focus, could easily produce the kind of visual fatigue that makes static things seem to move at the edges of perception. I have spent years since then trying to hold on to that explanation, turning it over and over, testing its weight, because the alternative explanation is one I still have difficulty accepting even now, even after everything that came after. But I remember, with a clarity that unsettles me more than almost any other detail from that time, that the shifting wasn't confined to moments of poor lighting or late-night exhaustion. It happened in the mornings too, in the first clear hours of a new working day, when my eyes were rested and my mind was sharp, and there was no reasonable excuse left to explain away what I was seeing. The materials themselves were equally strange, equally resistant to categorization. Some of the pages were vellum, and vellum I understood. I had spent years learning to read the particular texture of calfskin versus goatskin versus the rarer, more expensive sheepskin favoured by wealthier scriptoria, understanding how each aged differently, how each responded to humidity and handling and the slow accumulation of centuries. But other pages, and there were many of them scattered throughout the shelves in no order I could discern, felt wrong beneath my gloved fingers, in a way I still struggle to put into words. They were too smooth, smoother than any properly prepared animal skin should be, with none of the natural variation in thickness and texture that comes from a material once alive and now preserved. And they were warm. Not warm in the way a page might feel warm after sitting near a lamp, but warm in a deeper, more troubling way, a warmth that seemed to originate from within the material itself, rather than being borrowed from any external source, the way a body is warm, the way skin is warm, before it has fully finished becoming what it will eventually become. I remember the first time I noticed that particular warmth, how I nearly dropped the page, how I stood there for a long moment, with my gloved hand hovering just above the desk, staring at the sheet, as though it might do something further, might twitch, or curl, or respond in some way to having been touched. Nothing happened. It simply lay there, warm and smooth and covered in its restless, shifting script, as inert as any other piece of parchment I had ever handled. And after a while I convinced myself, as I convinced myself of so much during those early weeks, that I had imagined the sensation, that stress and unfamiliarity were beginning to play tricks on a mind unaccustomed to working in such isolating conditions. I began working 12-hour days almost immediately, though no one had instructed me to keep such hours. There was no clock in the room, no way to mark the passage of time, except by the growing ache in my back and the dryness that crept into my throat, no matter how much water I brought down with me each morning. I would arrive through that unmarked door above, descend through the service corridors and the ancient stone staircases, past the two silent men with their two silent keys, and lose myself entirely in the work until some internal sense, some bodily exhaustion rather than any external signal, told me it was time to climb back up into the world. I stopped noticing, during those weeks, the absence of sunlight in any way that troubled me. I want to be honest about that, because it frightens me now, looking back, how easily and how completely that absence became normal, became simply the condition of my life, the way a person stops noticing a persistent low hum after enough days of hearing it. And there were nights, more nights than I am comfortable admitting, when I found myself reluctant to leave at all, when the climb back up through the corridors and out into the ordinary noise and light of Rome felt less like a relief and more like an imposition, an unwelcome interruption to work that had begun, somewhere in those early weeks, to feel less like a job and more like a compulsion. I would sit at that small desk with its single weak lamp, surrounded by shelves I couldn't see the top of, working through pages that defied translation and defied comfortable understanding, and I would feel something I can only describe as a pull, a low and steady gravity drawing my attention deeper into the material, making the thought of stopping, of climbing back up into daylight and ordinary obligations, feel increasingly foreign and increasingly unnecessary. I told myself this was simply dedication, the kind of absorption any conservator feels when working on a project unlike anything they've encountered before. I did not yet have the vocabulary or the willingness to consider that the room itself might be asking something of me, might be shaping my desire to stay in ways I could not yet perceive from inside the experience. I should tell you about Elena, because without understanding what she meant to me, none of what follows will carry the weight it deserves. I have a daughter, 9 years old when I first descended into that room beneath Rome, living 400 kilometers away in Turin with her mother, in the apartment that had once been ours before it became simply theirs, before I became a visitor in my own daughter's life, present only through a screen, through scheduled calls, through the careful choreography that divorced parents learn to perform for the sake of a child who never asked for any of it. We spoke every Sunday, without fail, in the early weeks of my time in Rome. It was the one appointment I never missed, never rescheduled, never allowed the strange gravity of the archive to interfere with. She would sit at the kitchen table in Turin, the same table I remembered from 100 ordinary evenings, and hold her drawings up to the camera with the particular seriousness children bring to their own creative work, narrating each one with an intensity that made me laugh despite everything else weighing on me during that period. A horse with too many legs, a house with a chimney shaped like a spiral, though I didn't think anything of that detail at the time, didn't connect it to anything, because why would I have? She would ask every week when I was coming home, and I would tell her soon, tell her the work was temporary, tell her I was earning enough that maybe, once this contract ended, I could find something closer to Turin, something that would let me see her more than a screen allowed. I told myself, during those early calls, that I wasn't running from anything, that the distance between us was simply circumstance, simply the unfortunate geography of a career that had brought unexpected opportunity at an unexpected time. I have had to be honest with myself in the years since about how much of that was true and how much was a story I needed to believe in order to keep descending each morning into that windowless room, in order to keep accepting the increasingly strange warmth of the pages beneath my gloves, the increasingly restless shift of symbols I couldn't read. But whatever the truth of my own motivations, my love for Elena was never in question, never diminished. And it was through that love, through the one thread connecting me most directly to the ordinary world above ground, that I first began to understand something was deeply wrong. It happened gradually, the way most terrible things happen, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow accumulation of small wrongnesses that I explained away one by one, until explaining them away was no longer possible. 4 weeks into my work in the archive, our Sunday calls began to develop a strange quality I couldn't immediately name. Elena's voice, when she spoke, seemed to arrive a fraction of a second after her lips moved to form the words, not the ordinary lag of poor internet connection, which I know intimately from years of long-distance calls, but something subtler, something that felt less like a technical delay and more like a deliberate gap, a space inserted between action and sound that had no business existing in any normal transmission. I noticed it first during a call in which she was telling me about a school project, some assignment about local history, that had her excited in the particular way schoolwork occasionally manages to excite a 9-year-old. Her mouth would move, forming the shapes of words, and then, after a beat too long to be ordinary lag, the sound would arrive, matching the shapes, but trailing them by just enough to feel wrong, to feel like watching a poorly dubbed film where the audio and video have drifted slowly out of sync. I mentioned it to her mother afterward in a brief exchange of messages, and she said she hadn't noticed anything unusual on her end, that the call had seemed perfectly normal from where she sat. That should have alarmed me more than it did. Instead, I filed it away with all the other small anomalies I was accumulating during those weeks. Another detail to explain away with fatigue, with the strange acoustics of an old apartment building, with anything other than the possibility that something was genuinely, dangerously wrong. But it continued, week after week, growing subtly worse each time. The delay lengthened, almost imperceptibly, so gradually that I couldn't point to a single call and say this is when it changed, this is when it became something I could no longer dismiss. And beneath the delay itself, I began to notice something else, something I have never been able to describe adequately to anyone, including myself in the years since. It felt, during those calls, as though something was listening in the gap between her lips moving and her voice arriving, as though that small sliver of silence, that fraction of a second where sound should have been, but wasn't yet, had become a kind of aperture, a place where something could observe without being observed in return, could study the particular cadence and pitch of my daughter's voice, the shape of her sentences, the small verbal habits unique to a 9-year-old learning to narrate her own life. I know how that sounds. I knew how it sounded even then, sitting in my rented room in Rome, with the phone held too tightly in my hand, watching my daughter's face on the screen, and feeling, for the first time since I'd taken Baldassarre's contract, a fear that had nothing to do with old manuscripts or restless symbols, a fear rooted entirely in the growing, wordless certainty that whatever I had brought into my life by descending into that archive each morning, it had somehow found its way into the one connection I valued above everything else, and was learning, patiently and methodically, the exact shape of her. Baldassarre visited the archive once a week, always on what I assumed to be a Thursday, though without windows or clocks, I could only estimate the rhythm of days by counting the number of times I'd climbed back up into the world since my last visit from him. These visits followed a consistent pattern in the early months. He would descend through the same corridors I used, arrive at the desk where I worked, and ask a series of brief, clipped questions about my progress, how many pages I'd stabilized, which sections of shelving I'd moved through, whether I required any additional materials for the work. He never asked about the content of what I was restoring. He never seemed curious, in any conventional sense, about what the texts actually said, which struck me even then as strange for a man apparently responsible for overseeing their preservation. The first time I met him, at the cafe near the Tiber, he had seemed to me a man of perhaps 60 years, with the particular tiredness around the eyes that accumulates over decades of quiet, careful living, the kind of face you see on men who have spent their lives in service to institutions larger and older than themselves. I remember thinking, in that initial meeting, that he had the bearing of someone who had perhaps been a priest once, or come close to it, before some divergence in his path led him instead toward whatever obscure administrative role he now occupied. There was a stillness to him that read, at first glance, as the stillness of age, of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by anything the world might show him. By my 6th week in the archive, that impression had begun to shift, in ways I found increasingly difficult to reconcile with any rational explanation. He looked, when he arrived for his weekly visit, no older than 40. The eyes were the same. I want to be clear about that, because it's the detail that convinced me I wasn't simply misremembering our first meeting, wasn't simply constructing a false memory of an older man to make the change feel more dramatic than it actually was. The eyes retained that same tiredness, that same weary quality I'd noticed at the cafe, but the skin surrounding them had tightened, the fine lines that had creased outward from their corners smoothed into something closer to the skin of a much younger man. The grey that had threaded through his hair at our first meeting had receded at the temples, replaced by a darker, fuller colour that seemed inconsistent with even a very good dye job, inconsistent with anything short of an actual physiological reversal of the aging process itself. I told myself, as I told myself about so much during that period, that this was simply my perception failing me, unreliable after weeks of poor sleep and strange working conditions, and the low-grade stress that had been accumulating in my body since the strange delays began appearing in my calls with Elena. Perception is not a fixed and trustworthy instrument, I reminded myself. Memory reshapes itself constantly, softening some details and sharpening others, and it was entirely possible, I argued internally, that my memory of our first meeting had simply drifted, had made Baldassarre older in retrospect than he had actually been, in order to make sense of a change that hadn't actually occurred, or hadn't occurred to the degree I now perceived it. I might have continued believing that explanation, might have filed the strangeness of his changing appearance alongside all the other anomalies I was accumulating and dismissing, if I hadn't found the badge. It happened by accident, the way most discoveries in that room happened. I was moving a section of shelving to access a lower row I hadn't yet catalogued, and something small and rigid slipped from between 2 volumes and clattered onto the stone floor at my feet. I picked it up, expecting a bookmark, a forgotten tool, some ordinary object left behind by whoever had organized these shelves before my arrival. Instead, I found myself holding an identification badge, laminated but yellowed with age, the kind of official credential that might grant access to a restricted archive or a government building. The photograph on the badge showed a young man, perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair and the same particular tiredness around the eyes that I had come to associate over 6 weeks of Thursday visits with Baldassare himself. The resemblance was unmistakable, close enough that I felt a cold certainty settle into my stomach even before I found the courage to check the issue date printed along the bottom edge of the badge, half obscured by the general deterioration of decades. When I finally made out the numbers, I had to read them 3 times before I allowed myself to accept what they said. 1961, 65 years before that moment, if the badge belonged to who I now suspected it belonged to, and yet the man appearing weekly at my desk, growing visibly younger with each visit, could not possibly have been more than his mid-40s in appearance, could not possibly account for the passage of 65 years through any explanation I understood to be possible. I held that badge for a long time that evening, sitting alone at the small desk beneath the weak lamplight, surrounded by shelves rising into a darkness I still couldn't measure, and I felt, for the first time since arriving in that room, a fear that went beyond unease, beyond the accumulated small wrongnesses I'd been dismissing for weeks. It was the fear of a man beginning to understand that the ground beneath his understanding of the world had already shifted, silently and completely, without his permission or his awareness, and that he had been standing on that shifted ground for weeks already, working, breathing, existing within conditions that had nothing to do with the rules he'd spent his entire life assuming were fixed and reliable. I broke the rule on a night I can still recall with uncomfortable precision, though I've tried, at various points over the past 3 years, to convince myself that the details have blurred, that memory has softened the specifics into something more bearable. It hadn't. I remember the particular quality of the silence in the room that night, heavier than usual, the kind of silence that seems to press against the eardrums, rather than simply representing the absence of sound. I remember the way the desk lamp flickered once, briefly, before steadying again, and how I sat there afterward for several minutes, gloved hands motionless on the desk, waiting to see if it would happen again. I had been working with a particular fragment for nearly a week by that point, a torn section of one of the smoother, warmer pages that troubled me more than the vellum did, and something about the persistent, restless shifting of its symbols had begun to feel less like an ordinary visual phenomenon and more like a kind of pressure, a low, insistent pull toward understanding that I hadn't felt with any of the other material I'd handled during my weeks in the archive. Baldassare's instructions had been explicit from the very first day. I will restore. I will not read. I will not photograph. I had followed those instructions faithfully for 6 weeks, telling myself that professional discipline required nothing less, that whatever reasons lay behind the restriction were not mine to question. But that night, alone in the room with the badge from 1961 still sitting in my coat pocket where I'd placed it days earlier, unable to decide what to do with the knowledge it represented, I found that discipline finally failing me. I withdrew my phone from my bag, an object I hadn't used for anything beyond checking the time in weeks, since there was no signal that deep beneath the city, and photographed a single page, quickly, almost violently, as though speed might somehow lessen the transgression, might make the act less real than if I'd approached it with deliberate care. I didn't attempt any translation that night. I waited until I'd climbed back up through the corridors, back through the 2 silent men and their 2 silent keys, back out into the ordinary noise of Rome at what I estimated to be somewhere near midnight, and only once I was alone in my rented room did I finally open the photograph and begin searching, clumsily and without any real expertise, for translation tools that might make sense of an alphabet no established linguistic database seemed to recognize. I found forums, obscure corners of the internet populated by amateur cryptographers and language enthusiasts. People who spent their evenings attempting to decode everything, from the Voynich manuscript to invented scripts from fantasy novels. Most of what I tried returned nothing but garbage. Strings of unrelated symbols matched loosely to fragments of known alphabets. Results that made no coherent sense in any language I could identify. But one piece of software, built originally for comparing partial ancient scripts against known root systems, returned something different. It flagged a repeating pattern within the fragment, a sequence of 3 symbols that appeared, according to its analysis, no fewer than 11 times across the single page I'd photographed, an unusually high frequency for such a short excerpt, suggesting the phrase carried particular weight or significance within whatever larger text it belonged to. The software's best guess at translation, built from a comparison against several ancient administrative and legal scripts used historically for recording debts, tributes and obligations between parties, rendered the 3 symbols as a phrase in English: "The debt continues." I sat with that phrase for a long time that night, turning it over, trying to understand what it could possibly mean in the context of a sealed archive maintained beneath Rome by an organization that had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep its contents hidden from ordinary scrutiny. I didn't understand it fully then. I'm not certain I understand it fully even now, 3 years and an entire unraveling life removed from that room. But something in my chest went cold reading those words on my small phone screen, some animal certainty settling into me that had nothing to do with careful reasoning and everything to do with instinct, with the deep and ancient part of the mind that recognizes danger before the conscious intellect has finished assembling its case. I understood, sitting there, that I had stumbled onto something closer to a ledger than a scripture, an accounting system rather than a religious or historical text, a record of something owed, tracked meticulously across what the repeating frequency of the phrase suggested might be centuries, by people who, and this was the detail that frightened me most, the detail I couldn't shake as I finally set the phone down and tried, unsuccessfully, to sleep, had never agreed to owe it in the first place. Whatever debt those pages recorded, whatever ancient obligation the archive existed to track and enforce, it did not appear to be a debt entered into willingly. It was a debt imposed, extracted, continued across generations of people who had simply been born into its shadow, inherited it the way one inherits a name or a birthmark, without consent, without understanding, without any clear way of ever paying it off completely. The smell arrived before I understood what it was, and for a long time I told myself it was nothing more than the ordinary staleness of old paper, the kind of mustiness that clings to any room where centuries have been allowed to settle undisturbed. But this was different. Underneath the dust and the vellum and the leather bindings there was something sharper, something that caught at the back of my throat on certain mornings and vanished entirely on others, as if the room itself were deciding when I was permitted to notice it. Ash, I thought at first, though I could find no source for it, no candle stubs, no charred paper, nothing that might reasonably produce such a scent within stone walls that had not seen open flame in living memory. And beneath the ash, fainter, was something sweeter, cloying in a way that made my stomach turn before my mind had even finished identifying it. Candle wax, I told myself, though I knew, even as I thought it, that this wasn't quite right either. It was closer to rot, the particular sweetness of something organic breaking down slowly, privately, somewhere out of sight. I found myself sniffing at the shelves like an animal, running gloved fingers along the spines of books that had no business smelling of anything but must and glue, searching for a source that never revealed itself. I mentioned it, eventually, because I could no longer pretend I hadn't noticed. I brought it up to the 2 guards who held the keys between them, phrased as casually as I could manage, an offhand comment about ventilation, about whether the room's air circulation had ever been inspected. Neither of them answered. This in itself was not entirely unusual. They were men of few words, and I had grown accustomed to a kind of practiced silence from both of them, the silence of men paid to be present rather than communicative. But this silence felt different. It had weight to it. And then one of them turned his head and looked at me, properly looked, in a way he never had before. In all the weeks I had been coming and going through those doors, I had grown used to being looked past, catalogued rather than seen, the way one might glance at a piece of furniture to confirm it hadn't moved. This was not that look. This was the look of a man regarding something he pitied, something whose fate he already understood and could do nothing to alter, and could not bring himself to explain. I wanted to ask him what he knew. I wanted to demand an answer right there in the corridor, keys still hanging heavy at his hip, but something in his expression closed the question off before I could voice it. Some unspoken understanding that certain things in that building were not discussed, not because they were forbidden exactly, but because saying them aloud would make them undeniably, permanently real. That night I dreamed of Elena. It was not the first time she had appeared to me in sleep since I'd taken this position, but it was the first time the dream had felt less like memory and more like intrusion. She was standing beside me in the archive itself, in the very room where I spent my days. Her small hand fitted into mine the way it used to when she was younger and frightened of crowds. Except she did not seem frightened in the dream. She seemed at home. She was looking at the curling script that filled page after page of the oldest volumes, the symbols that even the most senior scholars who visited could not fully translate, and she was reading them aloud, fluently, without hesitation, without the halting, sounded-out cadence of a 9-year-old encountering unfamiliar words, but smoothly, as though the symbols were something she had always known, something encoded into her before she had ever learned to speak. And her voice was wrong. It carried the shape of her voice, the timbre I would know anywhere, but underneath it was something older, something that did not belong to a child at all, something patient and vast that was merely borrowing her mouth to be heard. I woke gasping, the ash and wax smell somehow following me out of the dream and into the waking room, thick enough that I had to sit up and breathe through my sleeve for a moment before it faded. I told myself dreams were dreams, that exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings were more than enough to explain a vivid nightmare about my daughter, but I could not shake the sense that something in that archive had reached past its walls that night, had found the one thread that still connected me to the world outside, and had used it, gently, almost lovingly, to remind me that it knew exactly where that thread led. I began sleeping with the light on after that, though it did nothing to keep the smell away, and did nothing at all to keep me from dreaming. In the days that followed, I found myself testing the smell almost obsessively, walking the length of the archive at different hours, to see whether it followed any discernible pattern, whether it thickened near certain shelves or thinned near the doors, whether it responded at all to the ordinary variables of temperature and airflow that might explain an odor in any normal building. It did not. It came and went according to a logic I could not map, sometimes overwhelming near the oldest cases and utterly absent moments later in the very same spot, sometimes present only when I stood perfectly still, vanishing the instant I moved to investigate its source more closely, as though it required a kind of stillness from me before it would reveal itself at all. I began to suspect, though I resisted the thought for as long as I could, that the smell was not a property of the room in any fixed sense, but something closer to a signal, released only when the archive itself had some reason to be noticed, some message it wished to convey through means other than words. I thought of old stories I had encountered in my scholarly training, tales of places that announced themselves through scent before revealing themselves through sight, warnings meant to reach the animal part of the mind before reason had a chance to intervene and explain them away. The dream, too, did not remain a single isolated occurrence. It returned in variations over the following nights, never identical, but always circling the same core image of Elena standing among the shelves, always with that unsettling fluency in her voice as she read symbols no living scholar had fully deciphered. In one version she was older, perhaps 12 or 13, her small hand grown larger in mine, though still recognizably hers. In another, she stood alone, without me beside her at all, reading to an audience I could not see, but could somehow sense, gathered in the darkness beyond the shelves, patient and attentive in a way that made the hair rise on my arms, even within the dream itself. I began to wonder whether these were dreams in any ordinary sense, or whether they were something closer to windows, brief and involuntary glimpses into a connection the archive had already established between itself and my daughter, established without my consent, established perhaps before I had even accepted this position, as though everything that had led me here had been arranged with her in mind from the very beginning, and I had simply been the door through which she was eventually meant to enter. The page I had been working on for the better part of a week was one of the more fragile items in the collection, a leaf so brittle that it seemed to hold its shape more out of habit than integrity. The fibers separated along a tier that ran diagonally from the upper corner nearly to the center of the sheet. This was the kind of work I had trained years for, the slow and deliberate art of coaxing damaged material back toward wholeness, without erasing the evidence of its age, without pretending time had not passed. I worked under magnification, humidity carefully controlled, adhesive applied in amounts so small they were measured in fractions of a milliliter, each fiber realigned with tweezers under a light that made my eyes ache by the end of each session. It was slow, exacting, meditative work, the kind that swallowed hours without my noticing, and I had grown almost fond of that particular page, the way conservators sometimes do with objects that demand enough of their attention to feel, briefly, like collaborators rather than tasks. I left it on the Friday evening, exactly where I always left unfinished work, tucked beneath its protective glassine sheet, held flat by the small weighted supports we used to keep vellum from curling as it dried. I remember locking the case around it with a kind of satisfaction, thinking that another 2 or 3 sessions would likely see it through to completion, that the tear was stubborn but not impossible, that I was making real progress. I went home for the weekend, the way I always did, back to the small rented room I kept near the station, and I did not think of the page again until Monday morning, when I unlocked the case to resume. It was whole, not patched, not merely holding together under the pressure of my careful mending, whole, in the way paper is whole, when it has never been damaged at all. I lifted it and turned it beneath the light, searching for some trace of the tear, some faint discoloration where adhesive might have dried, some seam my trained eye would recognize, even if a casual observer would not. There was nothing. The fibers ran continuously from edge to edge, as though the tear had simply never occurred, as though the version of this page that existed on Friday evening, torn, fragile, half in my care, had been quietly replaced by a version that had never known damage at all. My hands, in their thin cotton gloves, began to shake, not violently, but with the particular unsteadiness that comes when the body understands something before the mind is willing to admit it. I stood there for what must have been 10 minutes, perhaps longer, simply holding the page and turning it in slow rotations, waiting for the impossibility of it to resolve itself into some rational explanation. Perhaps another conservator had continued the work over the weekend, I told myself. Though I knew this to be false, I held the only key that opened that particular case, and the log confirmed no one else had entered the room. Perhaps I had misremembered the extent of the damage, though the photographs I had taken for documentation, still sitting in my folder, showed unmistakably the same tear I now could not find any trace of. There was no version of events that made sense except the one I did not want to accept, that something in this room did not merely tolerate my attention, but consumed it, converted it into a kind of nourishment that repaired what my hands alone never could have repaired so completely, so seamlessly, in a single, unsupervised weekend. It was in that moment, gloved hands still trembling slightly around the page, that the shape of my situation finally came into focus, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that I had misdescribed my own role from the very beginning. I had believed myself to be a restorer, someone brought in to heal these documents through skill and patience, someone whose labor moved in one direction only, from me, outward, into the material. But the material was not merely receiving my care, it was drawing from something deeper than technique, something that lived in the hours I spent hunched over it, in the devotion I brought, without even realizing devotion was being asked of me. Every hour of focused attention, every quiet act of human tenderness toward these fragile, curling pages was being drawn away from me and redirected somewhere the texts themselves could use it, the way roots draw water from soil, without the soil ever being consulted. I was not restoring the archive. I was feeding it, and it had simply allowed me to believe otherwise for as long as it needed my hands to keep working. Once I understood this, I began to notice the same pattern everywhere I looked, in places I had previously attributed to nothing more than the ordinary unpredictability of aging materials. A binding I had reinforced weeks earlier, one whose spine had been cracking along the same fold line no matter how carefully I treated it, suddenly held firm, without further intervention, the crack simply absent one morning, as though the leather had never known stress at all. Ink that had faded to near illegibility, on certain pages I had spent hours photographing, under different light sources, for the sake of documentation, began, over subsequent visits, to darken again, the strokes regaining a crispness that should have been chemically impossible for pigment that old. I stopped bringing these observations to Baldassare at first, telling myself I needed more evidence, more certainty, before raising something so clearly outside the bounds of reasonable professional concern. But privately I began keeping a second set of notes, hidden among my ordinary conservation records, documenting every instance of unexplained restoration I encountered, dating each one, cross-referencing them against the hours I had personally spent attending to that particular item. The pattern that emerged from those notes disturbed me more than any single instance had on its own. The degree of unexplained healing correlated almost precisely with the amount of attention I had devoted to each object. Not merely the technical hours logged in my official reports, but something harder to quantify, something closer to the emotional investment I brought to the work. Pages I had handled with distracted, mechanical care showed little unexplained improvement. Pages I had lingered over, worried about, returned to again and again, out of something resembling genuine tenderness rather than professional obligation, showed the most dramatic and complete restorations, the kind that left no trace of prior damage whatsoever. I began to understand that the archive was not simply drawing labor from me in some abstract sense, but something far more intimate. It wanted my care specifically, my worry, the particular quality of attention a person gives to something they have come, almost against their will, to love. And once I recognized that the material seemed to respond most powerfully to affection, rather than mere diligence, I found myself unable to stop offering it, even knowing now precisely what that offering cost me, because some part of the exchange had already begun to feel, disturbingly, like devotion given freely, rather than labor extracted by force. I confronted him the following afternoon, unable to carry the weight of what I now suspected any longer, without saying it aloud to someone who might finally answer honestly. I found him in his usual office, the one lined floor to ceiling, with catalogues and correspondence in half a dozen languages, and I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him everything, the smell that came and went at its own discretion, the dream of Elena reading symbols she could not possibly know, and above all the page, whole again as though it had never torn, restored by something that was not my hands. I watched his face as I spoke, searching for the flicker of confusion or dismissal I expected, the polite denial that would let both of us pretend I had imagined it all. It never came. He simply listened, his expression unreadable in the way it always was, and when I finished, he did not deny a single word. Instead, he sat down slowly, as though the conversation itself had cost him something physical, and I noticed again what I had noticed once or twice before, without letting myself dwell on it, that he looked older some days than others, that the lines around his eyes seemed to shift depth, depending on the light, depending on some rhythm I could not name. That afternoon he looked profoundly tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been awake far longer than any single lifetime should allow. He told me, in a voice stripped of all its usual formality, that the archive had kept what he called custodians for 400 years, conservators like myself, scholars drawn by curiosity or scholarship, occasionally the devout who came seeking something they believed to be holy. Each one, he said, arrived by invitation, though the nature of that invitation was rarely obvious to the one receiving it, a job posting that seemed too perfectly suited, a recommendation from a mentor who could not quite explain why they'd thought of this place, a chance encounter that in hindsight felt engineered rather than accidental. And each one, without exception, began paying down what he called the debt continues, a phrase he repeated more than once, as though it were a formula rather than an explanation. Years of their own life siphoned quietly away while they worked, absorbed by the same mechanism that had healed my torn page overnight. I asked him, my voice shaking now in a way I could not disguise, how long he himself had been here, what the identification badge sitting in his desk drawer with a date decades before his apparent age truly meant. He did not answer that directly. He only said that I was free to leave, that no lock on any door existed to keep me here against my will, that the choice, in the narrowest technical sense, remained mine to make. But then he added something that has stayed lodged in me ever since, delivered without any theatrical weight, simply stated as fact the way one might describe the weather. Most custodians, he said, did not want to leave by the time they reached this point in their understanding. That, he told me, was the cruelest part of all. Not the years being taken, not the strange healing of pages, or the smell in the walls, or the dreams that crossed distances they had no right to cross, but the slow reshaping of desire itself, until the very thing that was consuming you became the thing you no longer wished to escape. I left his office that day, more frightened than I had been at any point since arriving, not because of what the archive might do to me, but because of what he had just confirmed it had already done to him, and to how many others before him, and because some small, quiet part of me, even as I walked back toward my own workroom, was already beginning to wonder whether leaving was something I still genuinely wanted, or merely something I still remembered being supposed to want. I asked him one more question before I left his office that day, though I already half suspected I would receive no satisfying answer to it. I asked him what, precisely, the debt was owed for, what original transgression or agreement had established this arrangement between the archive and the long procession of custodians who had tended it across 4 centuries. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had taken on a distant, almost liturgical quality, as though he were reciting something he had repeated to himself so many times, across so many years, that the words had worn smooth, losing whatever sharpness they might once have carried. He told me that the texts within these walls were never meant to be read by anyone, not fully, not completely, that they had been sealed away by whoever first compiled them, precisely because full comprehension of what they contained was considered too dangerous a gift to leave unguarded. And yet knowledge, he said, has its own hunger, its own persistence, and cannot simply be locked away and forgotten without something continuing to tend it, to keep the seal intact, to prevent the slow decay that would otherwise release whatever these pages were built to contain. The custodians were not merely conservators in the ordinary sense. They were, in his words, the living seal itself, renewed generation after generation, each one paying the price that kept the deeper danger contained a little longer. I did not fully believe this explanation either, not completely, though something in the weary conviction of his voice, as he delivered it, made it harder to dismiss than anything else he had told me. I asked whether the debt could ever be considered paid in full, whether there existed some point at which a custodian's obligation ended and they were released cleanly, without cost to themselves or to anyone connected to them. He looked at me then, with an expression I can only describe as sorrowful, and said that in 400 years he had never once seen it happen, that the debt, once begun, seemed only ever to grow, seeking new avenues through which to continue collecting, long after the original custodian had given everything they had to give. It was this answer, more than anything else he told me that day, that I carried with me back through the corridors toward my workroom, turning it over and over, understanding only much later, once I had learned what my daughter was already beginning to whisper in her sleep, 400 miles away, exactly how literally his words had been intended.